Imagine controlling the sleep of an entire nation. At its peak, one single corporation operated over 10,000 luxury rolling hotel rooms across America. On any given night, more than 100,000 passengers slept in their beds. They were the absolute market dictator of long-distance travel. They were so incredibly powerful that they built their own perfect utopian city from scratch just to house their workforce. The sound of their massive industrial hammers echoed across the country. Then, the roaring machines were completely silenced. The empire evaporated. The sprawling red brick factories that once employed tens of thousands were left empty and decaying. They did not just face a temporary struggle. Their unbreakable monopoly was shattered. Their legacy was destroyed by the government, and their rolling palaces were sold for scrap metal. How does an empire that important simply disappear? Chapter 1. The Origins of Luxury. In the middle of the 19th century, traveling across America by train was an exercise in pure misery. Passengers did not board trains for comfort. They boarded them out of sheer necessity. The cars were nothing more than wooden boxes on iron wheels. Inside, hard wooden benches offered no back support. Ventilation was essentially non-existent. In the summer, the cars became suffocating ovens. In the winter, pot-belly stoves located at the ends of the cars provided uneven heat, often roasting those nearby while leaving the rest of the passengers freezing. The tracks were uneven. The suspension systems were entirely primitive. Every jolt, every bump, and every sudden stop threw passengers against the walls or into each other. Sleep was impossible. Ash and cinders from the locomotive smokestack drifted through the open windows, burning holes in clothing and leaving everyone covered in thick black soot. George Pullman experienced this nightmare firsthand. Born in New York in 1831, Pullman was not an engineer by trade. He was a cabinet maker and a savvy entrepreneur who had made a small fortune literally raising buildings in Chicago to install new sewer systems. He understood mechanics, but more importantly, he understood human nature. During an agonizing overnight train ride from Buffalo to Westfield in the late 1850s, Pullman found himself completely unable to sleep. As the train rattled violently over the tracks, he looked around at the exhausted passengers trying to rest on the rigid wooden seats. In that moment, he saw an untapped market. He realized that people would pay a premium if someone could just figure out how to make rail travel tolerable. Pullman began tinkering with the idea of a sleeping car. He convinced the Chicago and Alton Railroad to let him remodel 2 of their standard passenger coaches. Working with a master cabinet maker, Pullman stripped the cars down. He installed hinged berths that folded flat against the ceiling during the day and lowered down at night. He added cherry wood paneling and plush upholstery. The result was a massive improvement over the standard cars, but it was still just a modified coach. When he pitched the concept of building a dedicated luxury sleeper car from the ground up, the railroad barons laughed at him. The costs were astronomical. Rail companies were focused on moving freight and maximizing passenger volume, not providing a rolling hotel. They argued that the average American would never pay extra for a bed on a train. Ignoring the critics, Pullman poured his own money into a radical new prototype. He called it the Pioneer. It was an engineering marvel that cost an unprecedented $20,000 to build, roughly 5 times the cost of a standard rail passenger car. The Pioneer featured rich walnut interiors, intricate wood carvings, brass fixtures, and heavy velvet curtains. The ceiling was raised to accommodate the upper folding berths, making the car significantly taller and wider than any other car on the tracks. But this size created a massive problem. The Pioneer was simply too big to clear the bridges and station platforms along the existing rail networks. The railroad companies outright refused to alter their infrastructure for a single, absurdly expensive luxury car. The Pioneer sat idle. It seemed Pullman had made a catastrophic financial mistake. Then, in April 1865, tragedy struck the nation. President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. A special funeral train was commissioned to carry his body from Washington, D.C. back to Springfield, Illinois. The journey would take weeks, winding through major cities so the grieving public could pay their respects. Mary Todd Lincoln, the First Lady, was entirely exhausted and emotionally shattered. The organizers needed a car fit for her and the grieving delegation. The Pioneer was the only car in existence that offered the necessary dignity and comfort. Suddenly, the impossible happened. To accommodate the President funeral train, the government ordered the railroad companies to alter their bridges and widen their platforms along the route. The Pioneer was attached to the train. Hundreds of thousands of Americans lined the tracks to mourn their fallen leader, and in doing so, they all saw George Pullman masterpiece. The Pioneer became an overnight sensation. The modifications made to the tracks for Lincoln Final Journey permanently opened the door for Pullman massive luxury cars. A national tragedy had unexpectedly birthed an American empire. Chapter 2: Palaces on Wheels. Following the national spectacle of the Lincoln funeral train, George Pullman capitalized on the sudden demand for luxury rail travel. In 1867, he officially incorporated the Pullman Palace Car Company. The name itself was a bold statement of his ambition. He was not simply building better train cars. He was constructing rolling mansions designed to insulate the wealthy from the brutal realities of industrial travel. The interiors of a Pullman car were masterclasses in Victorian opulence. Passengers were surrounded by polished black walnut paneling, intricate wood carvings, and heavy velvet curtains that completely blocked out the soot and noise of the locomotive. Crystal chandeliers swung gently from the raised ceilings, casting warm light over plush, heavily upholstered seats. Pullman introduced the world to specialized dining cars, starting with a model named the Delmonico, complete with professional chefs preparing fresh gourmet meals in a tiny rolling kitchen. He built parlor cars for daytime travel, featuring individual swiveling armchairs. Every detail was engineered to project an aura of absolute wealth and sophistication. But Pullman's true genius was not in his carpentry. It was in his business model. Unlike other manufacturers who sold their equipment to the railroad networks, Pullman flatly refused to sell his luxury cars. Instead, he leased them. The railroad companies would agree to haul the Pullman cars as part of their standard trains. Passengers bought a regular train ticket from the railroad, but if they wanted to ride in the luxury sleeper, they had to buy a separate premium ticket directly from the Pullman Company. This arrangement was brilliant. It allowed Pullman to retain complete ownership of his fleet, ensuring a massive recurring revenue stream. More importantly, it allowed him to control the entire passenger experience. The railroads were notoriously terrible at customer service and maintenance. By keeping the cars and the staff under his own corporate umbrella, Pullman guaranteed that his brand would never be tarnished by the incompetence of a third party. The flawless physical environment of the cars was only half of the equation. To deliver the ultimate luxury experience, Pullman needed an army of impeccable service workers. Shortly after the end of the Civil War, he made a calculated and highly controversial staffing decision. He exclusively hired recently freed African American men to serve as porters on his trains. From a purely cynical business perspective, it was a masterstroke. Pullman knew these men faced immense discrimination and had very few employment opportunities, meaning he could pay them exceptionally low wages. For his wealthy, predominantly white clientele, the presence of black servants provided a level of subservient, nearly invisible service that catered to their expectations of high status. The porters were instructed to be ever-present but silent, anticipating every need before a passenger even had to ask. The Pullman porters quickly became the absolute backbone of the company, yet their daily reality was incredibly harsh. They were the face of the brand, working grueling schedules that often exceeded 400 hours a month. They were required to shine shoes, make beds, manage luggage, serve food, and deal with demanding or abusive passengers, all while maintaining a flawless uniform and a cheerful demeanor. They had no dedicated sleeping quarters on the early trains, forcing them to catch brief naps on baggage racks or in the smoking room chairs during the dead of night. Their base salary from the company was notoriously meager. Pullman intentionally kept wages low so that the porters would have to rely almost entirely on passenger tips to survive, forcing them to provide exceptional service out of pure desperation. Adding to the indignity, passengers universally referred to every porter simply as George, stripping them of their individual identities to casually reference the company founder. Despite the grueling conditions and low pay, the position of a Pullman porter became one of the most stable jobs available to black men in post-war America. It offered a chance to travel the country, network with influential passengers, and eventually build a foundation for the emerging black middle class. Armed with this unmatchable workforce and a superior product, George Pullman launched an aggressive campaign of corporate expansion. He systematically bought out weaker competitors or simply crushed them through superior service. He negotiated ironclad, exclusive contracts with the largest rail networks across North America. By the 1880s, the company had established an absolute monopoly. If an American was traveling overnight and wanted to sleep in a bed, they were paying George Pullman. He had conquered the railroad industry without ever laying a single mile of track. Chapter 3. The Pullman Utopia. By the late 1870s, American industry was booming, but it was also burning. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 had terrified the nation business elite. Workers, driven to desperation by low wages and brutal conditions, rioted across several major cities. Railroad tracks were torn up and depots were set on fire. George Pullman watched the violence from Chicago and concluded that the problem was not the inherent nature of capitalism, but the environment in which the workers lived. He believed that if working men lived in squalor, surrounded by saloons and vice, they would naturally become agitated and strike. His solution was breathtaking in its ambition. He would not just build a new factory, he would build an entire city from scratch. In 1880, Pullman purchased 4,000 acres of land on the western shore of Lake Calumet, about 14 miles south of central Chicago. He hired the brilliant young architect Solon Spencer Beeman and landscape designer Nathan Barrett to turn a desolate, marshy prairie into a working-class paradise. This was not going to be a typical muddy, chaotic company town. It was meticulously designed to be a capitalist utopia. Construction moved at a blistering pace. The town, modestly named Pullman, was an architectural marvel. It featured broad, tree-lined streets, manicured parks, and an artificial lake. The factory buildings themselves were ornate, designed to look more like college campuses than industrial plants. But the real attraction was the housing. At a time when most industrial workers lived in overcrowded, disease-ridden tenements without basic sanitation, the town of Pullman offered something entirely different. Every single home, from the modest workers' cottages to the larger executive houses, was built with solid red brick. They featured indoor plumbing, gas lighting, and daily trash removal. The town had its own state-of-the-art sewage system. There was a beautifully designed shopping arcade, an ornate theater, a library stocked with thousands of books, and a grand green stone church. On the surface, it was a breathtaking achievement. Visitors from around the world, including journalists and politicians, flocked to Illinois to marvel at what George Pullman had created. They wrote glowing reviews, calling it the most perfect city in the world. It seemed Pullman had successfully solved the great conflict between capital and labor. He had given his workers clean air, beautiful homes, and a safe environment. However, this perfection came with a hidden, suffocating cost. The town of Pullman was not a democracy. It was a corporate fiefdom, and George Pullman was its absolute monarch. The Pullman Company owned every square inch of the town. They owned the houses, the stores, the theater, and the church. Workers were not allowed to buy their homes. They could only rent them, and the terms of that rental were strictly dictated by the company. The control extended far beyond real estate. Pullman believed he knew what was best for his employees, and he enforced his moral code with an iron fist. Saloons and alcohol were strictly banned within the town limits. Town inspectors regularly entered workers' homes to ensure they were kept clean and up to company standards. If a worker damaged company property or even walked on the grass, they could be fired and evicted. Independent newspapers were not allowed to be published in the town. Even the books in the library were carefully curated to exclude any radical or pro-labor literature. Furthermore, the town was designed to be a profitable enterprise on its own. George Pullman publicly stated that the town would return a consistent 6% profit to his investors. The rents were high, often 20 to 25% higher than comparable housing in nearby Chicago neighborhoods. The prices at the company-owned grocery stores were also inflated. Workers soon realized they were caught in a closed loop. The company paid their wages, but then immediately clawed that money back through rent and living expenses. The beautiful brick houses began to feel like gilded cages. The workers had traded their autonomy for indoor plumbing. A famous quote from an anonymous worker perfectly captured the growing resentment. He said, "We are born in a Pullman house, fed from the Pullman shops, taught in the Pullman school, catechized in the Pullman church, and when we die, we shall go to the Pullman hell." The beautiful utopian town was fundamentally flawed, built on a foundation of absolute control, and it was only a matter of time before the pressure inside this perfect system reached a breaking point. Chapter 4. The Iron Hand of the Tycoon. The town of Pullman operated on a highly sophisticated system of economic extraction. George Pullman presented his city to the world as a grand philanthropic gesture, but the financial architecture told a completely different story. The town was explicitly designed to be an independent, profit-generating asset. Before the first brick was laid, Pullman mandated that the town itself must return a strict 6% profit on the capital invested to build it. This expectation dictated every aspect of daily life for the residents. The company was not just the employer. It was the sole landlord, the primary grocer, the utility provider, and the municipal government. This monopoly created a closed-loop economy that heavily favored the corporation. When workers received their paychecks, they rarely saw the full amount of their earnings. The Pullman Company automatically deducted rent, gas, and water bills directly from their wages before handing over the remainder. Often, workers were left with only a few dollars to feed their families and purchase clothing. Because the company held an absolute monopoly on commercial space within the town, the prices at the local stores were noticeably higher than in neighboring communities. Workers could theoretically shop outside the town limits, but the cost and time of travel made this difficult for those working grueling 10 or 12-hour shifts. The economic pressure was compounded by a pervasive atmosphere of surveillance and control. Pullman believed that to maintain his perfect utopia, he had to tightly regulate the behavior of its inhabitants. Company inspectors known informally as spotters roamed the streets and entered homes to ensure absolute compliance with company rules. A single scuff mark on a rental property wall or an unkempt garden could result in immediate fines. Workers who complained about the conditions, joined political organizations, or simply expressed dissenting opinions found themselves abruptly fired and evicted from their homes. The residents began to realize they were not citizens of a town. They were serfs living on a modern feudal estate. The gleaming red brick houses and manicured lawns masked a deeply oppressive environment where every aspect of existence was monitored and monetized by a distant corporate overlord. For over a decade, this system held together simply because the factory provided steady work. But the illusion of a benevolent utopia completely shattered in the spring of 1893. The United States economy suddenly collapsed in what became known as the Panic of 1893. Banks failed across the country. Credit markets froze. The railroad industry, which had been expanding recklessly for years, was hit exceptionally hard. As railroads filed for bankruptcy, orders for new luxury sleeping cars vanished almost overnight. Facing a massive drop in revenue, George Pullman reacted with ruthless efficiency to protect his profit margins. He immediately laid off hundreds of workers. For the thousands of employees he kept on the payroll, he drastically slashed wages. Piecework rates were cut so severely that average earnings plummeted by roughly 30%. It was a brutal blow, but wage cuts were a common corporate response to economic depressions in the late 19th century. However, Pullman made a fatal calculation that separated him from every other industrialist of his era. While he decimated his workers' incomes, he absolutely refused to reduce their living expenses. He decreed that the rents in the town of Pullman, which were already inflated, would remain exactly the same. He argued with cold, corporate logic that his role as an employer and his role as a real estate investor were two entirely separate business functions. A depression in the manufacturing sector, he claimed, had no bearing on the fair market value of his rental properties. The result was an immediate humanitarian catastrophe within the so-called perfect city. The automatic payroll deductions continued unabated. With wages slashed by a third and rent remaining fixed, workers began receiving paychecks of only a few dollars for 2 weeks of exhausting labor. In some extreme cases, workers opened their pay envelopes only to find a slip of paper indicating they owed the company money. As the bitter Illinois winter approached, families in the town of Pullman faced actual starvation. They lacked the cash to buy coal to heat their pristine brick homes or food to put on their tables. The utopian experiment had transformed into an economic trap, pushing thousands of desperate people right to the breaking point. Chapter 5. The Spark of Rebellion. The winter of 1893 to 1894 descended on the town of Pullman with brutal severity. Inside the pristine red brick houses, families were freezing. The economic equation designed by George Pullman had finally broken his workforce. Because the company automatically deducted rent and utilities before paying out wages, the massive pay cuts meant there was virtually nothing left over. Workers were receiving pay envelopes holding only pennies for 2 weeks of exhausting labor. Some envelopes literally contained a single check for 2 cents. Others received statements showing they owed the company money. Starvation became a tangible reality in the perfect city. Men who spent 10 hours a day installing crystal chandeliers, polished walnut paneling, and plush velvet cushions in luxury sleeper cars went home to unheated rooms and empty pantries. Fathers could not buy coal to heat their homes. Mothers resorted to begging for scraps in neighboring communities. The beautiful aesthetic of the town became a cruel mockery of the suffering happening behind every closed door. Sickness spread rapidly as the freezing temperatures and severe malnutrition took their toll on the children of the workers. The workers were not radical revolutionaries looking to dismantle capitalism. They were skilled mechanics, carpenters, seamstresses, and laborers who simply wanted to feed their families and survive the economic depression. Driven by pure desperation, they decided to appeal directly to the man they had once viewed as a paternal figure. Because the town was heavily monitored by company informants, the workers had to hold their meetings in secret, often gathering outside the town limits to speak freely. In early May of 1894, they formed a formal grievance committee composed of 46 representatives from various departments within the massive factory complex. Their demands were incredibly modest and driven by basic survival. They did not ask for a wage increase to pre-depression levels. They only asked that the company lower the rents in the town to match the reduced wages, or at least defer the rent payments until the economy recovered. They firmly believed that if George Pullman truly understood the depths of their suffering, he would surely show mercy. They still held on to a fading illusion that he was a benevolent leader who cared about the people building his empire. The committee secured a meeting with the company management, which included George Pullman himself. The workers presented their case respectfully but urgently. They detailed the starvation and the freezing conditions inside the company-owned houses. They laid out the mathematical impossibility of surviving on the current wage and rent structure. George Pullman listened to their pleas. Then, with characteristic coldness, he rejected absolutely everything. He reiterated his rigid stance that the manufacturing business and the real estate business were entirely separate entities that had nothing to do with one another. He flatly refused to lower the rent by a single cent. He told the workers that the company was already losing money on every train car they built, just to keep the factory open. This claim deeply insulted the men, who knew perfectly well that the company was continuing to pay 8% dividends to its wealthy shareholders and was sitting on a massive surplus of $25 million in undivided profits. Pullman dismissed the committee, offering them nothing but a vague promise to investigate the prices at the company grocery store. The ultimate betrayal came the very next morning. Despite Pullman promising during the meeting that no one on the committee would face retaliation, company foreman immediately fired 3 of the men who had spoken up on behalf of the workers. This blatant act of vindictiveness was the final spark needed to ignite the powder keg. The news of the targeted firings swept through the massive factory floors like wildfire. Decades of built-up resentment over the strict rules, the inflated prices, the lack of freedom, and the absolute control of the company town finally exploded. The workers had tried to play by the rules. They had tried to negotiate peacefully, and they had been met with supreme arrogance and cruelty. On May 11, 1894, a spontaneous vote was called among the workers. Nearly 4,000 men and women laid down their tools, abandoned their workstations, and walked out of the factory complex. The deafening noise of the heavy machinery slowly faded away until the building fell completely silent. The great engine of the Pullman Empire had ground to a complete halt. A local labor dispute had just begun, but it was about to escalate into the most destructive industrial conflict the nation had ever seen. Chapter 6: The Strike That Shook America. The walkout at the Pullman factory in May of 1894 began as an isolated local dispute over wages and rent. However, it quickly metastasized into the most severe national crisis since the Civil War. The striking workers knew that simply sitting outside the factory gates would not force George Pullman to negotiate. The company had massive financial reserves and could easily outlast a local strike. To win, the workers needed leverage, and they found it in the newly formed American Railway Union. Led by a charismatic labor organizer named Eugene V. Debs, the union was designed to bring all railway workers under one massive umbrella, regardless of their specific craft or trade. Just weeks before the Pullman strike, the union had successfully won a major dispute against the Great Northern Railway, proving their immense collective power. Desperate for help, the Pullman workers appealed to the union convention being held in Chicago that June. Debs was initially hesitant. He warned the delegates that a nationwide strike during an economic depression was incredibly dangerous and could destroy their young organization. He urged caution and attempted to open a peaceful dialogue with the Pullman Company. George Pullman, maintaining his usual stance of absolute corporate authority, completely ignored the communications and refused to acknowledge their existence. Infuriated by this arrogant dismissal, the delegates voted overwhelmingly to support the Pullman workers. On June 26, 1894, the Union launched a nationwide boycott. The strategy was simple but devastating. Members across the country were instructed to stop handling any train that included a Pullman car. Switchmen refused to connect the luxury sleepers to the locomotives. Brakemen refused to release the brakes. Engineers refused to drive the trains. If a railroad manager attempted to fire a worker for boycotting a Pullman car, the entire train crew would immediately walk off the job. Within days, the effect was paralyzing. Over 100,000 railroad workers across 27 states and territories joined the boycott. The vast railway network of the United States, the central nervous system of the American economy, suddenly stopped functioning. Freight trains sat idle in massive rail yards. Agricultural shipments rotted in their cars. Passenger travel ground to a halt. In major hubs like Chicago, the silence was deafening. The railroad executives, organized under a powerful consortium called the General Managers Association, realized they were facing an existential threat. If the Union won this battle, the workers would effectively control the entire transportation industry. The executives decided to break the strike using the full power of the federal government. They knew they could not easily justify federal intervention in a simple labor dispute, so they engineered a brilliant and ruthless legal trap. They began deliberately attaching United States mail cars directly behind the Pullman sleepers. Under federal law, it was a severe crime to obstruct the delivery of the mail. When striking railway workers decoupled the Pullman cars, the railroad managers immediately claimed that the Union was illegally halting the United States Postal Service. This tactic gave the railroad owners exactly what they needed. They bypassed local authorities, many of whom sympathized with the strikers, and appealed directly to Washington. United States Attorney General Richard Olney, a former railroad lawyer who despised labor unions, convinced President Grover Cleveland to intervene. On July 2nd, the federal government secured a sweeping court injunction that made the strike itself illegal. The injunction banned union leaders from communicating with their members or doing anything to encourage the boycott. Eugene Debs and the leadership ignored the court order, arguing it was an unconstitutional violation of their rights. In response, President Cleveland took the unprecedented step of deploying thousands of federal troops to Chicago over the bitter objections of the Illinois governor. The arrival of the United States Army on the 4th of July acted as a massive provocation. The relatively peaceful boycott instantly erupted into extreme violence. Angry mobs, containing both strikers and opportunistic rioters, began overturning rail cars, destroying tracks, and setting massive fires in the rail yards. The sky over Chicago turned black with smoke, as millions of dollars of railroad property burned. Buildings were gutted, and the vital infrastructure of the city was deliberately dismantled by furious crowds who felt the government had betrayed its own citizens to protect corporate wealth. The federal troops responded with lethal force, fixing bayonets and advancing through the chaotic streets. Soldiers fired their rifles directly into the crowds of protesters. Over the course of a few bloody days, roughly 30 people were killed and hundreds more were seriously injured. The local labor dispute had transformed into a deadly urban war, leaving the nation in a state of absolute shock and fear. The perfect capitalist utopia George Pullman had envisioned just a decade earlier had ultimately resulted in the United States military gunning down American citizens in the streets. Chapter 7. Bitter Victory. The deployment of federal troops and the sweeping court injunction effectively crushed the American Railway Union. Eugene V. Debs and other union leaders were arrested for violating the court order. They were sent to federal prison, leaving the striking workers without leadership, organization, or financial support. The boycott collapsed as trains slowly began to move again under heavy military protection. By mid-July of 1894, the Great Pullman Strike was definitively over. It had cost the railroads millions of dollars in lost revenue and massive property damage. But the corporate executives had achieved their primary goal. They had completely destroyed the most powerful labor union in the country. Back in the town of Pullman, the situation was utterly desperate. The workers had received no pay for over 2 months. They were systematically starved into submission. With no other options for survival and winter approaching, they trudged back to the factory gates to beg for their old jobs. The Pullman Company agreed to rehire many of them, but the terms of their return were deliberately humiliating. Every single worker had to sign a formal pledge explicitly stating they would never join a labor union or participate in any strike. These agreements ensured that the workforce remained entirely subservient to the whims of management. George Pullman had won the battle. He had successfully defended his absolute authority over his company and his manufacturing town. However, the victory was incredibly bitter and ultimately destructive. The strike had exposed the dark reality of his capitalist utopia to the entire world. Before the unrest of 1894, Pullman was celebrated across the globe as a visionary philanthropist. After the strike, he was universally despised. The national press, which had once praised his model city as a miracle of modern industry, now ruthlessly attacked him. Newspapers published scathing editorials, calling him a feudal baron, an oppressor, and a tyrant. Politicians from both major parties publicly distanced themselves from his brand. Even his fellow wealthy industrialists felt he had gone too far. They believed his stubborn refusal to simply lower the rent or meet with the committee had unnecessarily provoked a national crisis that threatened the entire American capitalist system. To address the public outrage, President Grover Cleveland appointed a special national commission to investigate the root causes of the monumental strike. The resulting report was a devastating legal and moral indictment of George Pullman. The commission concluded that the strike was the direct result of the company's severe wage cuts combined with its absolute refusal to adjust housing costs. The report explicitly condemned the paternalistic control Pullman exerted over his workers. It stated clearly that the aesthetic beauty of the town could never compensate for the lack of basic American freedoms and self-determination. The utopian experiment was officially declared a failure by the federal government. The legal foundation of the empire then began to crumble under intense scrutiny. The state of Illinois launched a lawsuit against the Pullman Company. The state argued that the original corporate charter only allowed the business to manufacture rail cars. It did not grant the company the right to own and operate a municipal government. In 1898, the Illinois Supreme Court delivered a fatal blow to the town of Pullman. The court ordered the company to sell off all of its non-industrial properties. The residential homes, the commercial stores, the theater, and the church all had to be divested to private owners. The Pullman Company was legally stripped of its power to act as a landlord. The closed-loop economy that had generated so much hidden profit was dismantled forever. George Pullman did not live to see the final dissolution of his beloved town. The intense stress of the strike, combined with the universal public hatred directed at him, took a severe toll on his physical and mental health. In October 1897, he suffered a massive heart attack and died. His death revealed just how much fear he harbored regarding the people he once claimed to protect. His family was terrified that angry former employees would steal or desecrate his body. To prevent this, they arranged a burial that resembled the construction of a bank vault. His coffin was wrapped in tar paper and coated in thick asphalt. It was lowered into a deep pit lined with reinforced concrete. Workers then poured tons of liquid cement over the casket, sealing it beneath a massive block of steel and stone. The man who had built rolling palaces for the wealthy and brick cages for the poor spent his final moments ensuring that his own grave would be entirely impenetrable. Wentz Chapter 8, The Antitrust Sledgehammer. The dawn of the 20th century brought a change in leadership for the embattled Pullman Palace Car Company. Following the death of its founder, the board of directors appointed Robert Todd Lincoln as the new president. The irony was profound. It was the funeral train of his father, President Abraham Lincoln, that had originally launched George Pullman into the national spotlight. Now the son was tasked with guiding the massive corporation through an increasingly modern and heavily regulated era. Under Lincoln management, the company continued to expand its reach. By the 1920s, Pullman was operating over 10,000 luxury sleeping cars across the United States. On any given night, more than 100,000 passengers were sleeping in a Pullman bed. The company had become the largest single hotel operator in the world, and their cars were constantly in motion. However, this staggering success rested on a business model that was becoming a target for both labor organizers and the federal government. The first major crack in the Pullman Foundation came from the very workers who made the luxury experience possible. For decades, the African American porters had endured low wages, exhausting hours, and severe corporate discipline. They had watched the Great Strike of 1894 fail, but by 1925, the landscape of American labor was shifting. A charismatic civil rights activist named A. Philip Randolph helped establish the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. It was a bold and incredibly dangerous move. The Pullman Company fought the new union with the same ruthless aggression it had shown in the past. Management deployed corporate spies, fired union organizers, and actively intimidated workers who attended meetings. The battle between the massive corporation and the porters dragged on for 12 agonizing years. Randolph and his union endured financial ruin and constant harassment, but they steadily built political power and public support. Finally, in 1937, the Pullman Company was forced to concede. They signed a collective bargaining agreement with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. It was a monumental victory. This was the very first major labor contract signed between a powerful American corporation and a black labor union. The agreement drastically reduced the working hours of the porters and secured significant wage increases. More importantly, it officially broke the absolute paternalistic control that the company had held over its workforce since the days of George Pullman. While the labor union was dismantling the company control from the bottom, the United States government began dismantling it from the top. The Pullman Company did not just dominate the sleeping car market. It held an absolute, unbreakable monopoly. Because Pullman manufactured the cars, owned the cars, and staffed the cars, no other company could compete. If a railroad network wanted to offer overnight service, they had to sign an exclusive contract with Pullman. Independent manufacturers could not sell sleeping cars to the railroads because the railroads were legally bound to use Pullman equipment. In 1940, the United States Department of Justice decided it was time to shatter this monopoly. The government filed a massive antitrust lawsuit against the Pullman organization. Federal prosecutors argued that the company was actively restraining trade and violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. They presented evidence showing how Pullman used its vast wealth and exclusive contracts to crush potential competitors before they could even enter the market. The legal battle raged through the federal courts through the early years of World War II. The definitive blow landed in 1944. A panel of federal judges ruled completely in favor of the government. The court declared that the Pullman Company was indeed operating an illegal monopoly and issued a drastic ultimatum. The corporation was ordered to physically divide itself. It could no longer be both a manufacturer and an operator. It had to choose one business and completely divest itself of the other. After exhausting their appeals, the corporate directors made their decision. They chose to keep the manufacturing division, which they believed held more long-term industrial value. They put the legendary sleeping car operating division up for sale. In 1947, a massive consortium consisting of 57 different American railroad companies formally purchased the operating division. The transaction effectively ended the true Pullman empire. The company that had dictated the terms of American travel for over 3/4 of a century had been legally split in half. They were no longer the undisputed masters of the rails. They were now simply a manufacturing plant, entering a post-war era where the very concept of passenger train travel was about to face its greatest threat yet. Chapter 9. The Era of Sky and Asphalt. As the United States emerged from the shadows of World War II, the nation entered a period of unprecedented economic prosperity and rapid technological advancement. The American public, weary of wartime rationing and restrictions, was hungry for modern conveniences and absolute freedom. This shifting cultural mindset had a profound and immediate impact on the national transportation landscape. For nearly a century, the railroad had been the undisputed king of long-distance travel. If you wanted to cross the country in comfort, you bought a ticket on a train pulling Pullman sleeping cars. But the late 1940s and early 1950s introduced a new paradigm that completely bypassed the iron rails. The automobile, once considered a luxury item or a short-distance runabout, became the centerpiece of the American dream. The federal government heavily subsidized this transition by launching the Interstate Highway System under President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Suddenly, massive ribbons of smooth asphalt were connecting every major city and rural town across the continent. Families no longer had to adhere to the rigid schedules of the railroad corporations. They could simply load their luggage into the trunk of a personal car and leave whenever they pleased. The automobile offered a deeply personal level of autonomy that no train, regardless of how luxurious it was, could ever hope to match. Furthermore, the rapid expansion of the roadside motel network meant travelers could find cheap and convenient overnight lodging without paying the premium prices demanded for a Pullman sleeper berth. While the highway system siphoned away the middle-class vacationers, an even more formidable threat emerged from above to steal Pullman's most lucrative demographic. The wealthy elite and corporate executives had always been the core customer base for the rolling palaces. However, commercial aviation was advancing at a staggering pace, fueled by military innovations developed during the war. By the late 1950s, the commercial jet age had officially arrived. Aircraft like the Boeing 707 revolutionized the concept of distance and time. A grueling train journey from New York to Los Angeles that previously took 3 full days of continuous travel was suddenly reduced to a mere 6-hour flight. For the business elite, time was money. The definition of luxury fundamentally changed. It was no longer about spending 3 days surrounded by heavy walnut paneling, plush upholstery, and crystal chandeliers. True luxury was now defined by pure speed and efficiency. The wealthy abandoned the rail stations and flocked to the newly built airports. The railroad companies, which were now operating the sleeping cars themselves after the antitrust breakup, saw their passenger revenues completely collapse. They desperately tried to compete by introducing sleek stainless steel streamliner trains, but they could not fight the physics of air travel or the convenience of the personal automobile. Passenger rail service quickly became a massive financial liability for the train networks. With the railroads bleeding money on their passenger divisions, the demand for new luxury sleeping cars evaporated almost overnight. The Pullman Company manufacturing division found itself trapped in a massive, rapidly shrinking market. The sprawling brick factories in the town of Pullman, which had once struggled to keep up with endless orders, fell eerily quiet. The company was forced to confront a terrifying reality. The product they had spent nearly 80 years perfecting was no longer relevant to the modern world. In a desperate attempt to survive, management tried to pivot their massive industrial capacity. They sought government contracts to build military equipment during the Korean War. They aggressively bid on contracts to manufacture transit cars for urban subway systems in cities like Chicago and New York. They even tried building heavy industrial machinery and truck trailers to keep the assembly lines moving. While these frantic diversification efforts brought in some temporary revenue, They were simply not enough to sustain the enormous overhead of the historic Pullman operation. The workforce, which had once numbered in the tens of thousands, was systematically reduced through wave after wave of permanent layoffs. The rolling palaces that once defined American luxury were gradually pulled from active service and sent to the scrapyard. The great industrial giant was dying a slow, undeniable death, entirely unable to compete with the sheer velocity of the modern era. Chapter 10. The Last Train. As the 1960s began, the Pullman Company was effectively a ghost of its former self. The majestic sleeping cars that once symbolized the absolute pinnacle of American luxury were now viewed as outdated relics of a bygone era. Passengers had overwhelmingly chosen the speed of jet airplanes and the convenience of the interstate highway system. The company that had once commanded a fleet of 10,000 cars and dictated the travel habits of the nation was now bleeding money at an unsustainable rate. The grand era of cross-country rail travel was ending, and Pullman was caught directly in the collapse. In a desperate bid to keep their massive manufacturing facilities running, the corporate leadership attempted to pivot away from luxury sleepers. They turned their attention to the gritty, utilitarian world of urban mass transit. Pullman began aggressively bidding on government contracts to build subway cars for major metropolitan areas. They secured orders from the Chicago Transit Authority and the New York City Transit Authority, churning out heavy, stainless steel commuter trains. It was a humiliating fall from grace. The same factory floors where master carpenters had once carved intricate walnut paneling and installed crystal chandeliers were now producing sterile, basic transit cars designed solely for maximum passenger density. They also tried to diversify into heavy industrial equipment. The company manufactured flatbed trailers for the trucking industry, ironically building the very equipment that was helping to destroy their core passenger rail business. They produced freight cars and specialized shipping containers, but these efforts were ultimately futile. The profit margins on commuter trains and flatbeds were razor thin compared to the lucrative sleeping car monopoly they had once enjoyed. Furthermore, they were entering these new markets late, competing against established manufacturers who already possessed streamlined, highly efficient assembly lines. The sprawling, multi-story brick factories in the town of Pullman were simply not designed for modern mass production techniques. The decline of the company was mirrored by the decay of its physical surroundings. The utopian town that George Pullman had built with such meticulous care was falling apart. After the Illinois Supreme Court ordered the company to sell off the residential and commercial properties in 1898, the town lost its pristine, uniform appearance. Over the decades, the historic red brick houses aged, and the once immaculate parks became overgrown. As the manufacturing orders dried up in the 1960s, the workforce was subjected to a relentless series of layoffs. The massive production halls grew dark and quiet. The vibrant community of highly skilled artisans, mechanics, and laborers gradually dispersed, leaving behind empty buildings and echoing corridors. The final, definitive blow came in 1968. After years of mounting financial losses and dwindling contracts, the Pullman Company officially ceased production of railroad passenger cars. The sprawling factory complex on the south side of Chicago was shut down completely. The great steam engines and heavy stamping presses went silent for the last time. The corporation itself was subsequently bought, sold, and fragmented into various holding companies. Its legendary name was slapped onto freight car divisions and technology firms that had absolutely nothing to do with the original vision of luxury travel. The empire was systematically dismantled and erased from the industrial landscape. The legacy of the Pullman Company extends far beyond the rusting tracks and abandoned brick factories. The very workers they sought to exploit ultimately helped reshape the nation. The brotherhood of sleeping car porters, born out of the harsh conditions of the Pullman system, became a cornerstone of the American civil rights movement. A. Philip Randolph, the Union leader who fought Pullman for 12 years, went on to be a key organizer of the 1963 March on Washington. The men who were forced to answer to the name George transformed their fight for basic labor rights into a nationwide struggle for racial equality, leaving an enduring mark on American history that far outlasted the company itself. Today, the story of the Pullman Empire serves as a stark warning about the fleeting nature of absolute dominance. For nearly a century, they held a true monopoly. They commanded immense wealth, controlled vast political power, and even attempted to engineer human society by building their own private city. Yet all of that power could not protect them from the relentless march of technological progress and the shifting desires of the American consumer. They were destroyed because they built a perfect business model for an era that simply ceased to exist. When the world decided it wanted to fly rather than ride, the greatest passenger rail company on Earth was rendered entirely obsolete. The magnificent rolling palaces are gone, but the history of their meteoric rise and catastrophic fall remains a permanent monument to the ruthless, unforgiving efficiency of American capitalism.